Today, I'm going to talk a bit about the life of Sviatoslav the Brave. He was a Grand Prince of the Kievan Rus during a period of great expansion that they experienced, and it was spurred on by his conquests from between the Danube River and the Volga, all along the Pontic Steppe there. Now see, over here in the United States, we don't hear about a lot of this period of history in Europe, in Eastern Europe. I think the story of Sviatoslav is fascinating. It's very interesting. Actually, one of the first videos that I had ever made was a video like this, talking about his life and stuff. And as I mentioned, here in the United States, we, like, I honestly had never even heard of him or his conquests of Khazaria or the First Bulgarian Empire. I'd never heard of these things until a few years ago, because as I said, they don't teach these things here in the United States. Now, a lot of what I'm going to tell you here you can easily look up online or on an encyclopedia, but I'm going to tell you nonetheless. Now, I'm no expert on it or anything, but as I said earlier, I think his life was fascinating, and that it was a very important part of history. Now, in the last video that I'd made many months ago, I had some people in the comments section, they were saying that Sviatoslav was Slavic, and this isn't entirely wrong, because Sviatoslav, he was the first Kievan Rus leader with a purely Slavic name. His mother was named Olga, and Olga is I suppose you could say, the Slavic equivalent of the Germanic name Helga. And his father was named Igor, which is the Slavic equivalent of the name Ivar. Now, there was this huge debate amongst academics back in the Soviet Union decades ago, and the debate was over whether the Kievan Rus were Slavic or whether they were Germanic. Now, the Rus, I believe they were Slavic, but of course, you look at the ruling class, a lot of the nobility, I believe they came from Scandinavia, making them Germanic, North Germanic. But eventually, this nobility and the leaders, I believe they became Slavicized, as did a lot of the Scandinavians who ended up moving to Novgorod or Kiev. So, I think that, Sviatoslav, I think he was Germanic. He was a member of the Rurikid dynasty, and if you go back many decades, you will read the story that about how Rurik came over from Sweden, and he was asked to help administrate to the Slavic people who were living in that part of Europe at the time. And the Rurikid dynasty, it lasted for, I think, 700 years, all the way up until the Romanov dynasty took over there in Russia. And it's funny too, there was as I mentioned, there was a huge debate in the Soviet Union whether there was one school of thought that was called the Normanist school of thought, which claimed that the Rus were Scandinavian, and then there was the anti-Normanist thought that claimed that they were Slavic. Either way, they're still native European, and the Rus were eventually Slavicized over many decades. And it's funny too, because they think the name Rus, which led to the name of Belarus and Russia, they think that the name Rus was what the Finnish people called the Swedes across the Baltic Sea. So it's really interesting to think that if this is true, that a Finnish name for the Swedes led to the name for the nations of Belarus and Russia. I'm not sure if this is true, but I have read it. Because the Finns, they called the Swedes the Rutsi, or the... many of these names I'm going to pronounce, I'm sure I'm pronouncing them wrong. But I'll continue nonetheless. Sviatoslav, he was born in the year 943 AD. In the year 945, when he was only about 2 or 3 years old, his father, Igor, who was the Grand Prince at the time, was cruelly murdered, in a sense, by the Slavic tribe, the Drevlians. He had went to collect his annual tribute from the Drevlians, and when he arrived at their largest village to collect the yearly tribute, the Drevlians rose up. They killed all of Igor's warriors, his retinue, and then they took Igor to a sacred grove, an old pagan sacred grove, not far from the village. I'm sure Igor fought fiercely, but was exhausted, and his captors somehow had 2 large birch trees. They had the trunks bent down to the ground. I guess they may have had, I don't know how they would have had this, but it's a pretty horrible way to die. I'm sure Igor fought fiercely because he knew that his life was drawing to a close in a horrible fashion. The Drevlians, they tied him up, each limb to one of the tree trunks. And I'm sure Igor knew it was over. Perhaps he said something to his gods. The Drevlians probably said some words to their Slavic gods. And then basically, Igor was drawn and quartered by the birch trees. I'm sure it was bloody. I'm sure it was brutal. But anyway, the Drevlians' leader, he was vying to get more power, and he was wishing to get Olga's hand in marriage. And I believe the Drevlian leader sent ambassadors to Kiev requesting her hand in marriage. But Olga was a very fierce woman. She raised up an army. She basically went in there and destroyed the Drevlians' largest village. She killed their ruler. She was a very fierce woman. Sviatoslav, he was only 2 or 3 years old when this all happened. And Olga ruled as regent in his place because he was very young. He was still a toddler. She sent Sviatoslav to Novgorod to the north to be tutored by a Varangian warrior named Asmud. And Asmud taught him things, taught him how to fight, things about the world. This was a very common practice in Kiev. Now, Varangian, of course, is the Greek word for Viking. It is the Eastern Vikings that sailed down the Volga River and the Danube, the Dnieper. And I believe the old Slavic word for the Varangians was Varyag, which is pretty similar. Now, there's not a lot known about Sviatoslav's life. Certainly not about his childhood. And there's a lot of questions about his family itself. Now, Sviatoslav, when he became of age, he despised administrating. He despised the act of ruling, it appears. Instead, he preferred to ride around the countryside there in Eastern Europe, on the Pontic steppe and in the forests there. He rode around with his druzina, and druzina is it's just another word for a company, a retinue of warriors. He had a life of constant warfare, it appears. As I said earlier, he didn't care for the aspect of administration. Now his druzina, it is said in the primary chronicle that they just rode around the countryside, collecting tribute, fighting. They never carried any wagons with them or tents. They would just live off of the land. They would go hunting and perhaps take some of the crops of the conquered. It's said they traveled light, and if they were unable to find food, they would slay one of their weaker horses to have some meat. It's a very rough living. It was a very, very wild time, I'm sure. That's going to blow it up. Anyway, Sviatoslav had aspirations for increasing the wealth of the Kievan Rus and their influence. His biggest rivals, of course, were Khazaria, the Jewish state. It's up for debate. I made a video a while back, I'll have a link to it down below, about my thoughts on Khazaria. And I'd never even heard of the Khazar Khaganate until a few years ago. I wonder why this is, but it's a matter for that video. Anyway, the Khazars, they were a Turkic people, and it is said that they converted to Judaism as a way to avoid bending the knee to the Islamic caliphates to the south, and to avoid bending the knee and adopting Christianity of the Byzantine Empire to the west. Now, Sviatoslav's biggest rivals were the Byzantine Empire, the Pechenegs, which were a Turkic tribe that were spread throughout the Kievan Rus' territories, the Khazars. But he oftentimes, during his battles, he would employ some of these Pecheneg mercenaries in his battles. In the year 965, he took down the Khazar Khaganate, and this was a huge conquest because Khazaria was one of the wealthiest states in Eastern Europe at this time. They sat at a strategic crossroads of the Silk Roads, and they were very wealthy because of their position, and they were traders, and they grew very wealthy over the centuries. But Sviatoslav raised up an army of Kievan Rus, his druzina, and he employed some Magyars and some Pecheneg mercenaries. Now, he went in there and he laid waste to the large Khazar cities of Sarkel and Atil, the capital. It is said that even a couple of years after he had destroyed Atil, that a person had came through there, I forget who it was, but it said that not even a single grapevine was growing there, that he completely destroyed it. Now Sviatoslav, he had no aspirations of conquering the territory, it appears, of Khazaria. He just wanted to cripple them economically, and Khazaria lingered for, I think, a couple of centuries after Sviatoslav had laid waste to their empire, but they never ever recovered. They never ever came close to having as much power as they once did. Sviatoslav, he also destroyed the First Bulgarian Empire. He also fought against the Volga Bulgars very often. He defeated the king of the First Bulgarian Empire, Boris II. Now, one thing you will notice when you study this period of history in this area of the world, the Byzantine Empire would commonly play all of these other states around them against each other. They would manipulate. I'm not the biggest fan of the Byzantine Empire, to tell you the truth. But anyway, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire during this time was John Tzimiskes. And a lot of the sources that we have about Sviatoslav comes from the Byzantiums, the Byzantine Empire. I don't know if I pronounced that even correctly, but anyway, it is said that, I believe it was in the year 970 or 971, there was a truce made, and it was at this time that John Tzimiskes had convinced Sviatoslav to go to war against the Bulgarian Empire. And he was paid, I think, 15,000 pounds of gold and was promised some territory. Now, it is said in the meeting between John Tzimiskes, it was recorded by Leo the Deacon, I think. He wrote down, he was a member of John Tzimiskes' court there, and I think that it's recorded that he recorded Sviatoslav's appearance. It said that Sviatoslav was a bright-eyed man. He was of average height, but a very sturdy build. His warriors were all very rough people. It said that Leo stated that Sviatoslav was much more sturdy than John Tzimiskes was. And Sviatoslav, he wore a bushy mustache, a wispy beard, and he had one long lock. He shaved his head other than one long lock of hair. And it is said that Sviatoslav resembled the members of his Druzina, but his garments, his robes were white and they were much cleaner. Very interesting. Now, Sviatoslav then, he went into Bulgaria, and he destroyed the First Bulgarian Empire, as he had promised to do to John Tzimiskes. Now, Sviatoslav, he was a staunch pagan his entire life. His mother, Olga, herself, when she was 67 years old, converted to Orthodox Christianity. And I'm sure Sviatoslav was pressured somewhat by the Byzantines and others to convert to Christianity, but he refused to. It is said whenever he made his oaths to John Tzimiskes, he swore on the names of Perun and Veles, two prominent Slavic deities. Once Sviatoslav had conquered Bulgaria, the First Bulgarian Empire, I think he seen the potential for the wealth there. And he had thoughts to move the capital of the Kievan Rus from Kiev to a city called Pereslavets, and I'm probably butchering that. But it is a city that is on the Danube River, right at the mouth of it where it runs into the Black Sea. Now, John Tzimiskes had caught wind of this and wasn't very pleased. There was a large battle. He sent a lot of Byzantine warriors, and Sviatoslav was entrapped. I believe it was for 65 days, and I can't remember the name of the city right off. But eventually Sviatoslav and the Rus had to come to terms after being besieged. And Sviatoslav agreed to cede his territorial conquests in Bulgaria for safe passage back to Kiev and some food and horses for his men. Now, Sviatoslav, as he was heading back home to Kiev, he was ambushed by the Khan Khazaria. I'm probably butchering his name. He was a leader of a large Pecheneg tribe who attacked the Rus as they were having portage over the Dnieper River. Dnieper or Dniester. I might be getting some of this wrong, but as I said, you can look it up yourself. Now, Sviatoslav, he was killed in this ambush. He was only 30 years old. He had a very short and violent life. And Khan Khazaria, as a trophy, had Sviatoslav's corpse decapitated, and he had the top cut off of Sviatoslav's skull, and he used it as a drinking chalice. It's pretty brutal. Now, Sviatoslav, his story is fascinating, I think, and there's many details I left out, I'm sure. And as I said, you can look these up for yourself. But he's often overlooked here in the West, I believe. As I said, I always paid attention in history class a lot in school. I read a lot of books too when I was younger. But I never once heard about Sviatoslav the Brave and his conquests and his life. Now, Sviatoslav's sons, upon his death sparked off a fratricidal battle, basically. His sons, Yaropolk, Oleg, and Vladimir, they were, basically they battled for whoever was going to become the next Grand Prince. Oleg was hunted down and killed by Yaropolk, and Vladimir, who I believe was the youngest, fled to Scandinavia and was there for 3 years. While he raised an army, he came back down to Kiev and slayed his brother. He had his agents do it. Vladimir also is an important figure in Slavic history because he is who led the Rus to formally convert to Orthodox Christianity. Now, it is said that he converted to this because he aspired to marry, I forget her name, she was a Greek. She was a sister of the emperor, Byzantine emperor at the time. I think her name was Anna, but I might be wrong. But yeah, he basically gave up his native worldview for a pretty wife. It's amazing what throughout history women can make something do. It's just the way of the world, I guess. But anyway, if you're interested in them, look more into them for yourself, because as I said, there's a lot I've left out here. I hope y'all have a great day. Thank y'all for watching. Bye-bye.